World Insight with Tian Wei.
朝鲜半岛形势出现了明显的积极的转变。
The DPRK and the U.S. at odds over denuclearization efforts. Is the Singapore summit deal worth the paper it's written on? And iPhone maker Apple, the first ever American trillion-dollar company, a good thing or bad thing for tech consumers? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today with souring diplomacy between the DPRK and the U.S. The two countries vowed to work together towards the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula at the landmark summit in June in Singapore. However, after 2 months, the U.S. has kept the diplomatic and economic pressure on the DPRK. And the DPRK criticized alarming U.S. impatience on denuclearization despite Pyongyang's goodwill gestures. Could they eventually bury the hatchet in pursuing a common goal? Before we get down to the discussion, let's take a look at the latest situation.
Twists and turns in relations between the DPRK and the U.S. Challenges facing the Korean Peninsula were among the main topics at last Saturday's forum hosted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called for maintaining sanctions against Pyongyang.
We expect the Russians and all countries to abide by the UN Security Council resolutions and enforce sanctions on North Korea. Any violation that detracts from the world's goal of finally fully denuclearizing North Korea would be something that America would take very seriously.
The appeal was made following media reports of a confidential UN paper which said that the DPRK has not stopped its nuclear and missile programs. Last Friday, the U.S. Department of the Treasury announced sanctions on an individual and 3 entities, including a Russian commercial bank, for alleged links with the DPRK nuclear program. The DPRK Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho said at the ASEAN meeting, the DPRK stands firm in its determination and commitment to implementing the joint statement the two sides reached in Singapore. What Ri found alarming were what he saw as insistent moves by the U.S. in the wrong direction. Rather than responding in kind to measures taken by the DPRK, Ri said the U.S. is raising its voice louder for maintaining sanctions and backing away from declaring an end to the war. The DPRK has taken so-called goodwill measures to meet targets from the Singapore summit, including a moratorium on nuclear and missile tests, the dismantling of a nuclear site, and the return of the remains of U.S. soldiers killed in the Korean War. It has also improved communication with the international community. Pyongyang and Seoul will hold a reunion for families separated by Korean War this month, which is part of efforts to carry out the Panmunjom Declaration signed by Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in in April. Kim Jong-un has visited China 3 times this year. On Tuesday, Ri Yong-ho is visiting Iran, which bears the brunt of reimposed sanctions after U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal.
Will the DPRK and the U.S. eventually meet eye to eye on denuclearization? What about the other countries that are also involving in the discussion? In our Beijing studio, we have Mr. Yang Xiyu, who is a senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., we invited Jenny Tang from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome, Jenny. Also in Washington, our pleasure to have Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to the 3 of you, a very strong panel. I want to go directly to Mr. Paul first. What do you make of the recent quite active, shall I say, diplomatic efforts by the DPRK of talking to different players on the issue of denuclearization and in an effort to be not let alone on the international stage? Mr. Paul.
Well, I think what you're seeing is a continuation of the reactivation of North Korean diplomacy since the beginning of the year, and they've done a terrific job of breaking out of their isolation over the previous 2 years of nuclear and missile tests. And today, you find people are competing to be in touch with the North Korean leader. This is a very strong move on their part to try to break down the sanctions regime and to move to their definition of denuclearization with a different agenda from what the United States has been seeking.
Ms. Tao, you have been doing a lot of research on 30 and North about the DPRK over the years. So what do you make of their efforts, as Mr. Paul put it, since the beginning of this year? Is that approach working among some of the key players on the issue of denuclearization?
Well, absolutely. I think it's working extremely well, especially in winning back old friends. So at the end of last year, when the maximum pressure policy was at its height, a lot of countries that had traditionally friendly relations with North Korea had stepped away and said that they were going to stop relations with North Korea until further progress was made. And I think North Korea has really made a lot of inroads into winning back those friends and winning back those connections to the outside world, and using the U.S. DPRK process as part of the justification for that. They're on the path towards denuclearization. They're doing unilateral moves. The question is, what is the U.S. doing in that process, and are they living up to their end of the commitment as we move down that negotiation road?
Well, according to the U.S. side, of course, the U.S. is far from satisfied with the denuclearization efforts of the DPRK. That rhetoric has been repeating for quite some time. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called for continuous pressure on Pyongyang at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting also recently. Take a look.
He said, "I've also emphasized the importance of maintaining diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea to achieve the final, fully verified denuclearization of the DPRK as agreed to by Chairman Kim." He also called on ASEAN countries to strictly enforce all sanctions, including the complete shutdown of illegal ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum destined for North Korea. That did not sit well with DPRK Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, who said despite goodwill measures taken by the DPRK, Washington was raising its voice louder for maintaining sanctions against the DPRK.
So on the one hand, you see there has been a lot of exchanges at different levels between DPRK and the United States since the Singapore summit. However, on the other hand, Mr. Yang, I have to mention that to you, you see that both sides are having very different descriptions of exactly what happened, or what they have agreed upon, and what should be the plan.
Well, the two sides actually act towards the same direction, say, improve relation between the two for denuclearization. However, in terms of denuclearization, the two sides have a totally different assessment and expectation. U.S. complained, as earlier mentioned, do nothing by North Korea, but North Korea argued they have done several things. For example, dismantling the site and going to dismantle the engine side. However, they insist on the principle of action for action. North Korea argued we have done several actions, waiting for American actions, but the U.S. waiting for more actions from North Korea. So that is the contradiction and the difference between the two. However, on the other hand, neither Washington nor Pyongyang want to see the collapse of the initial stage of interaction. So the picture is, on one hand, the exchanges remain continued, but on the other hand, actions actually has been halted from both sides.
Is Washington continuously doing this stress test against the DPRK, Mr. Paul? I mean, eventually, how much is enough, so-called enough action from the DPRK so that the U.S. would also react? Is the U.S. have any plan about reaction at all?
Well, the gestures that have been taken so far, closing the nuclear test site, dismantling the missile test site, returning a couple of prisoners, and returning some MIA remains, really don't have much to do with the nuclear program or the missile program. They've got a lot to do with earning kinds of brownie points for North Korea with other countries to try to dismantle the sanctions regime. The administration in the United States made a huge mistake in not detailing precisely what we need to satisfy our desire for denuclearization, but stage by stage and step by step. They just went for the quick Hail Mary pass, as we say in American football. and it's not working, and it's now putting a lot of pressure on the relevant officials in the Trump administration to get results when their pressure tactics are actually producing less pressure on North Korea rather than more. Very
interesting said, Mr. Paul. Ms. Tao, I may not be an American soccer fan to know all these terminologies, but I do know some of the practices used, like maximum pressure, and also do not tell about the bottom line from the U.S. side as a negotiation tool. That has been used in many occasions, including about trade disputes, for example, between the United States and some of the other trade partners. So, Ms. Tao, here is the thing, once again, does the U.S. know at what point will the U.S. begin to act? Because it's better know about that, otherwise the U.S. can be left alone in this process while the other partners in the region and on the issue could work with the DPRK, questioning, does the U.S. really sincere in putting their words into action, Ms. Tao?
Well, I think that this is the big problem right now, is that the Singapore Summit Declaration was not a detailed agreement, did not lay out any of the details of what it would take to satisfy either side. What it did was it established a negotiation agenda, and because we've done this diplomacy process backwards, having the summit before the work has been done, I think we just have unrealistic expectations on both sides. The idea that Bolton was talking about the door is open, North Korea needs to walk through it, they're not going to walk through it unilaterally. Things are not going to magically happen. They still need to be negotiated. The details still need to be negotiated. The moves that have been made so far have been more in the line of confidence-building measures, because there is not a technical agreement in place yet. And so until you have that agreement, certainly the actions that North Korea has taken do not impact the core capabilities of their nuclear or missile programs, but are meant to show that they're serious, that they said they were going to do something, they've fulfilled that commitment. We don't know what the U.S. said that they would commit to in that process, other than halting the military exercises. And so the question is now is, what has happened behind closed doors? What were these confidence-building measures? Are both sides moving forward with them? And when are we going to get serious about the negotiations and have a mechanism set up for constant negotiation? Because we're not going to get a technical agreement with, Secretary Pompeo running to Pyongyang once every couple of months.
Well, certainly he has been running quite frequently recently, even though he has disputes with his DPRK colleagues about exactly what's being discussed. That's very interesting. Ms. Yang, though, Ms. Tao mentioned something very important. That is, what is likely to be the way forward? Of course, that question has been raised many times. Earlier, Mr. Yang, for example, there were the mechanism of six-party talks. There were the players, like other countries, could also join in to smooth the process once there is a stumbling block. Of course, that's not necessarily going to be the obvious mechanism anymore. So, Mr. Yang, despite the fact that DPRK leader visited China quite recently, over the past few months, several times, in fact, can China and other players really play some instrumental role in making the two sides sit down and really work on the details?
Yes, absolutely yes, because simply by U.S. and the DPRK cannot solve the complex nuclear issue, because there's no mutual trust between the two. So any fundamental substantive deals cannot be made only by the two parties. So basically, I argued the whole course of the denuclearization has gone through the three phases. The first phase is a bilateral engagement between 1993 to 2002, and the second phase failed. And the second phase is a multilateral mode, six-party talks, and failed again. Now, it seems to me that on the surface, enter the bilateral mode again by DPRK and USA. But I would say this phase would be bilateral plus the related parties to play the different roles to facilitate, support, and mediate the bilateral deals. So that is the basic situation now.
2.5, I guess, just say. Mr. Paul, do you agree with that, though? It seems that the Trump administration put a huge weight on this approach they've been using, which is so-called maximum pressure. They try to also praise themselves, suggesting this is the success, and they would like to spread around with this model to the other issues that the U.S. is struggling with internationally, for example, with Iran as well. So, Mr. Paul, this is crucial, but it seems that the U.S. side has not necessarily have any specifics. Mr. Paul.
Well, among the problems is that the reality of the situation and the policy of the Trump administration are growing apart from each other. The administration seems to be quite prepared to stick to the 2017 kind of strong maximum pressure approach. And they say this with a straight face in private meetings in public, but you can plainly see that it's not gaining that kind of traction. We now have the internal report of the UN Supervision Commission, which says that there have been lax enforcement of the sanctions so far, and therefore how we get to a better approach is going to require some new thinking and some new approaches. I think Professor Yang's remarks about 2+ make some sense. Getting additional parties in to do different roles to make up for the fact that the American government failed to get the proper attention paid to the detailed preparations before the Singapore summit. It doesn't have to be the end of the world, but it's going to require a lot of diplomatic activity, and it cannot be done by the President and the Secretary of State all the time. They need subordinate officials empowered to follow through on the negotiations.
Ms. Tang, though, I totally understand what Mr. Paul has been saying, but the question is, do others really have confidence in the current administration you have in Washington and trust the process that the party in the White House is likely to follow, because there are many occasions, I wouldn't mention them one by one, that the other parties feel they are being let down. So, Ms. Tang, on the DPRK issue particularly, what are the players that they can do, at least from their perspective, could quicken up the process of denuclearization?
Well, certainly this is the test of the administration now to see if they can make good on this, what is an interesting opportunity. And I think there is a lot of room for skepticism until they fill the key roles. For instance, Ambassador Yoon's role, the North Korea policy advisor, has not been filled yet. And I think until they make those key appointments, it's very hard to take it seriously, and it's hard to, set up a serious mechanism for negotiation. Again, as Douglas Paul said, it's not going to be a process with just the President and the Secretary of State trying to negotiate a technical deal. That's not how it's done, and at some point, Pompeo's going to get busy. He is Secretary of State. And so, we need those key actors in place that can focus on this issue, that can take it seriously, that can spend the time with it and spend the time with the North Koreans to really work up a new plan and work up a new relationship and work out the details. And until we see that happen, I think there is a lot of room for skepticism as to how far we can go down this road.
Well, the U.S. is struggling among the Washington apparatus about what to do. Mr. Yang, DPRK, very active internationally on the world stage. You see the foreign minister also making a trip to Iran, which is under the same, kind of sanctions as the DPRK is from the United States. And Mr. Yang, these kinds of diplomatic maneuvering coming from the DPRK, to what extent can it win more hearts and minds, and also a proactive attitude on the eventual negotiation if there were one in the future?
Well, I think North Korea diplomacy now is conducting a new tactics. On one hand, they are trying to slow down the substantive bilateral negotiations with U.S. for the denuclearization. But on the other hand, they are more active in the wider range of diplomacy, engaging more players, related players.
Give us some example. Give us some example, Mr.
They increase their contacts with China, Russia, even you mentioned Iran. That's an indirectly related party about the issue.
And of course, South Korea.
Of course, South Korea. And meanwhile, even with the United States, they slow down the working level engagement with U.S. and the high level engagement with U.S. For example, Pompeo and his counterpart, we haven't seen a new meetings. But they try to maintain the momentum by sending letters from the top leader Kim Jong-un to top leader President Trump. To maintain the momentum. So on one hand, slow down the process of negotiation, but on the other hand, keeping the momentum for the bilateral engagement between DPRK and the USA, designed to increase pressures on U.S. when U.S. increase pressures on DPRK.
Right, Mr. Paul, we already see some pressures coming from the other players. For example, Russia has been debating inside the Security Council of the UN, suggesting there should be reduction of sanctions against the DPRK. Meanwhile, Russia is also working with the DPRK on the energy and the oil issue. China, of course, has been doing its own diplomacy at the ASEAN and some of the other occasions by the foreign minister and state councilor, and also the state, the number one in China, the Chinese President Xi Jinping. You also see South Korea, not only at working level, but also on the much higher level, trying to figure out some kinds of agenda for the future. Some of the other countries too. So, Mr. Paul, at this point, it's the failure of the United States to connect with the other players and to work with the DPRK on how to start a serious denuclearization negotiation be taken by others as a point of not serious at all about what has been designed at the summit, but taken by the others as only an occasion for handshake and political show-off?
Well, people will come away with their own conclusions. I think you can say fairly, as an objective observer, that the Trump administration achieved a high water mark last year in organizing multilateral sanctions on North Korea. And this now is being followed up by an excessive reliance on bilateral mechanisms and an ineffective effort to mount the support of other countries to achieve the results they hope to achieve. Maybe there's some muddled thinking going on. You mentioned Iran earlier. The administration has been announcing new sanctions on Iran. There, the domestic situation is much looser, much more contentious, and much more susceptible to sanctions than is the situation in North Korea. So we're kind of mixing apples and oranges talking about these two kinds of problems, even though there are some complementarities, both being nuclear programs, both having missile programs. But the idea that we can go it alone and achieve the kinds of results that we achieved in the previous year when we work collectively has got to be fixed. We've got to get back to multilateral diplomacy, as your other two guests have been saying.
Ms. Town, midterm election coming, that is always a big moment politically. We are building to it. You see also the trials going on inside the United States, investigating against President Trump and his family members. So where would this DPRK, or shall we say, Korean Peninsula denuclearization issue lie in the overall blueprint for President Trump and his party to win once again in the midterm and probably leading up to the next presidential election? Or maybe the bottom line, to escape his possible big political, shall I say, disaster?
Well, American politics is very hard to predict these days.
Yes.
I would say certainly, North Korea is a foreign policy issue that has played well for Trump so far, especially among his base. And if there's gains made in the nuclear process, in the negotiation process with North Korea at key moments, in the election cycle, it could work to help Trump in the election itself. Again, especially among his base and those that are sort of wavering around his base. But certainly it's hard to say because there is a lot going on in domestic politics that is working against him. And if you look at sort of the special elections that have happened so far, they've been working against him as well. But so North Korea does become a very key issue in this election, or could be a very key issue in this election. And I think it's certainly something that we're watching for in that process.
Jenny Town, Douglas Paul, last but not least, Yang Xiyu. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Tech titan Apple, the first ever U.S. company valued at over $1 trillion. What this means for tech consumers right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday, Friday on CGTN. Moving on to the tech world, last Thursday, Apple became the first ever $1 trillion publicly listed American company. The iPhone maker's share price rose nearly 3% to end about $207 on Wednesday. That gave the tech giant a market capitalization of a little more than $1 trillion. Apple has rallied about 9% since Tuesday on strong second quarter financial results. Apple CEO Tim Cook, in a memo to employees on Thursday, called the $1 trillion valuation a significant milestone. The Silicon Valley stalwart stock has surged more than 50,000% since 1980 initial public offering. For more, for more discussion on Apple's value, we have in our Beijing studio Andy Mok, who is the founder and president of Red Pagoda Resources. In Lansdowne, we invite Christopher Versace, who is the chief investment officer of Tematica Research. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start by talking about this $1 trillion company, largest ever when it comes to the market price. What do you make of this gigantic business entity, Mr. Mok? Is there an issue of monopoly?
Well, I think that the fact that Apple has reached $1 trillion market cap is certainly a milestone. But from a business perspective, because stock markets are driven by as much by real-world fundamentals as by investor psychology. That being said, is it a monopoly? I think it's important to note, too, there are about 1 billion Apple devices that have been sold throughout the world. It's a closed ecosystem, so it's not just the hardware, it's the App Store as well, the operating system. So yes, I think it is accurate to describe it as a monopoly.
All right, Mr. Versace, what do you make of that fact? Will monopoly help the company, particularly the consumers, to enjoy as much as they can on a fair basis?
Well, I think I would first disagree with the notion that Apple is a monopoly. When we take a look at the smartphone sales, we look at the market share numbers, Samsung and even Huawei have now passed Apple in terms of market share. So I think it's hard to say that they are truly a monopoly, and I think this $1 trillion market cap really reflects the affinity that its users have for its products, the ability to squeeze profits out of its devices and its services. And I think investors are the ones that are willing to pay for what they see as future growth from Apple, given the number of investments that they have made. And as Tematica, as we look at the world, we continue to move into this increasingly digital lifestyle where Apple is one of several key competitors. We have Facebook, obviously, we have Alphabet, we have Alibaba. So again, I think it's hard to say that Apple is a monopoly in the truest sense of the word.
All right. If you two do not agree about whether it is a monopoly or not, let's move on to a question closely related to that. The reason why you say, Mr. Versace, that many are using Apple is because they are seeing its potential. So Apple, though, compared to Google, is not necessarily a very open ecosystem, and yet consumers have been religiously almost following Apple over the past 10 years. Having said that, though, there are recent changes because Apple has been earning more from services rather from selling of hardware. And Mr. Versace, that also led many to question what is going to be the style of business and the business model for Apple for the future. For example, about its apps and apps-related sales, whether others could still have a play on the Apple platform, Mr. Versace.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. There's no doubt that over the last 10 years, the iPhone has become the bulk of Apple's sales and profits. So of course, when the smartphone growth starts to slow, not just at Apple, but in the industry overall, you know, people tend to get worried. But what Apple has done is smartly grown its services business, which is everything from Apple Pay to iCloud to Apple Music, and they're making investments in other content that will be folded into the services business. And what I find particularly appealing about that is the push-pull that you have between Apple devices and Apple services. So, you know, if you look at a person who owns a Mac, they might have Apple Music or iCloud. If you look at an iPad, they might have Texture or Apple Music, or an iPhone where they're going to have a number of Apple services. So it keeps what we call the ecosystem very sticky with the consumer. And to your point about Apple versus Google, you know, there are aspects of an open system, but when we think about privacy, safety, and security, Apple has much more control over that closed system. And I think in today's world, where people are concerned about their privacy, their financial information, their health information, that goes a long way with consumers.
But Mr. Mark, as I also asked earlier, we see that Apple is gradually trying to wipe out some of the other that could make use of the Apple platform. For example, right now it's talking about remove some of the apps and app-affiliated purchasing possibilities on its affiliated marketing scheme. Obviously, some of the news organizations, for example, who have been putting their content on Apple's platforms and earn quite some bucks as a result of that, now need to worry where are they going to put their services in the future. Apple is arguing that its own editorials and its own content providing is good enough for the consumer. So are we going to see a much more closed system, even when it comes to services, when it comes to Apple?
Well, I think the whole premise on which Apple has built it is a closed system. I mean, the argument that they make is that that allows for a more integrated, higher quality experience. And to the point, it's not a true monopoly in the strict sense of the word, but when we look at the profits that Apple earns, it's not just on the services, but they earn, before the launch of the iPhone X, about $150 on a phone, which is 5 times what Samsung earns and about 10 times what Huawei earns. So although Apple has never led in terms of unit sales or overall market share, they've captured something like 90% of the industry profits. So I think a large part of that stems because they are the gatekeeper.
They are the gatekeeper. Mr. Versace, you want to respond to that? And also particularly about what I just asked, which is about the services. It seems to be ever more closed than it used to be because they want to earn the money itself rather than let the other players to earn the money, at least part of the money, on its Apple platform.
So a couple thoughts on that. You know, first, yes, Apple does have the lion's share of the profits, and they do charge premium devices, but they have people who are willing to buy them, not balk at them, whether they buy them outright or choose to finance them. So to me, if we follow the consumer, it says Apple must be doing something that the consumer wants. There are, you know, no shortage of device options out there for smartphones and others. So the question we have to ask is, what is Apple doing right that consumers want? As far as the services business goes, as we talked about previously, it's no secret that Apple is going to grow its own content. So I can see them probably squeezing out some other apps as they bring their own proprietary apps to market. But again, this is nothing different than Apple has done in the past, where they have acquired technology companies to help improve their roadmap. I pretty much see it as Apple just taking that strategy and applying it to content.
Very interesting. What would that mean if they apply it to content? I mean, after all, there are not many hardware companies such as those that are making mobile phones in the world, and yet when it comes to content, there are enormous amount of them internationally. So is this going to mean a very different picture if you look at Apple's service and if you look at the consumers who are using Apple, their potential of getting the best out of the services? Mr. Versace, very briefly, sir.
Yes. Yes, I do. I think the way that we see the types of companies we see producing media today are going to change. We're seeing Facebook, Alphabet, Amazon, and Apple, as well as others, throw their hats in the ring to deliver proprietary content in order to woo consumers to their devices or their services.
All right. Having said that, though, Apple is also an international company. the $1 trillion coming from so many markets around the world. China, for example, is one of those major markets. Mr. Mok, of course, the geopolitics is a big thing for many of those recently, particularly if you see with the backdrop of China-U.S. trade war. Apple's Tim Cook recently said, take a look at this, what he said. Our view on tariffs is that they show up as a tax on the consumer and wind up resulting in lower economic growth and sometimes can bring about significant risk of unintended consequences. That's what he said about the trade war going on over there between China and the United States. Of course, he remained, he said, optimistic. But Mr. Mok, for a company almost become a new symbol of American business, earlier this Coca-Cola, but now people talk about Apple. So what is going to be the vulnerability of that tag on its own head, in its head?
Well, I think any iconic American brand, whether it's Apple, Starbucks, I think is another example, rightly is concerned about these U.S.-China trade tensions because they are very visible symbols and easily could become collateral damage. I think that being said, though, Apple is, I think, uniquely positioned in that it's shown that their customers are very price insensitive, that they can get away with charging $800, $900, even $1,000 for a smartphone. So I think Tim Cook is very right in saying that this is a tax on the consumer because I'm sure they will and will be able to successfully pass that through to the final consumer.
Right. Mr. Versace, as the rules are changing when it comes to international trade, as the so-called trade war going on with all kinds of possibility as a result, what does it mean for multinational companies, giants, shall we say, $1 trillion market price, like Apple?
Well, I think when we look at the question of where these large companies, whether they're U.S. or some other country, where they're based, the question becomes, where is the future growth to be had? And it's no secret that for a company like Apple, they are targeting China, they're targeting India. So I think the question becomes, what's the financial impact of these tariffs should they go into effect? What does it mean for the price of their components? What will Apple do in terms of adjusting their price
What do you think?
on the devices that they sell or the services they produce? Well, if the tariffs go into effect, I think we could see Apple potentially raise its prices. It's not going to subject, it might be willing to digest some profit pressure, but at the end of the day, I think it will likely increase its prices to offset the tariffs, and that will probably hit consumers.
Right. Both of you talk about the big tech firms. In fact, if you take a look at some of the recent latest information, last Friday, Apple's stock market value reached a little more than $1 trillion, as we mentioned earlier. Amazon is now the second largest publicly listed U.S. company with a market capitalization $889 billion, followed closely by Alphabet and Microsoft at over $850 billion and $830 billion, respectively. A list of them. The question is, what's going to be their role for the future when it comes to consumer, when it comes to their negotiation with the government and the international governance, and when it comes to the so-called world order even, because now some of them are much bigger than a middle-sized economy and the country in the world. Mr. Versace, may I invite your views first?
Sure. I think we have to step back and take a look at some of the tailwinds that are driving what we're talking about. You know, in the case of Amazon, it's the shift towards online shopping or digital shopping, if we factor in mobile, as well as the adoption of cloud services. If we look at Microsoft, it's the same thing in terms of cloud. If it's Alphabet, you know, Google search, obviously, but also a number of other businesses that they're doing, whether it's YouTube and their own offering of streaming content, streaming music. Apple, I think we've talked about the devices, you know, the device of choice by a large number of people, as well as their increasingly sticky services that they're building out. The backdrop of this is the increasing digitization of our life, or as we at Tematica call our digital lifestyle investing theme. And there seems to be no slowdown in that. In fact, I would argue that how we communicate, how we shop, how we transact is becoming increasingly digital. And with the advent of some newer technologies like 5G, the Internet of Things, the connected home, the connected car, that we're going to see an explosion in these businesses that are powering these companies. So I think that odds are Apple's probably the first company to reach $1 trillion valuation, and there will be others. The question is, who will they be and what countries will they be from, whether it's Amazon or Alibaba.
Right. And as you mentioned, some of the key words, 5G, driverless cars, smart homes, and many of these new trends is going to transcend the economy, many economies around the world. The question is, what role will these tech companies play in their negotiation in a way about a future for the economic model with the current governance system, which is still lacking behind. But on the other hand, how to make sure these companies will follow legally and protect the rights of the consumers. That's another question. So both sides of the same issue. Mr. Mark, before we go, your thoughts?
Well, I think this is an incredibly important issue because it's not just the digitization and the rise of the mobile net, 5G, et cetera, but it's also concentration of market power, because I think the dynamics of these industries tend towards winner take all. So I think this is a very, very real question about concentration of wealth, concentration of power that can lead to unintended consequences like fake news that we see with Facebook in the United States. So I think these are very real, very current issues that do need to be addressed.
We hope we'll have more occasions to discuss all of these issues in detail if we have the time. Thank you so much for both of you for being with us, Christopher Versace and Andy Mark. Really appreciate it. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel as well. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tuning in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.